I now live in Toronto, Canada, but I lived pretty much all of my life in California in Silicon Valley, so it was kind of delightful to see the room names named after where I'm from. I am... Hello. What happened? Oh, everything okay? I'm Lime Daring on the internet. I use that as my screen name everywhere on Twitter. I'm also going to be uploading my slides into Speaker Deck, and you can also find me on Lime Daring there. I'm going to be throwing a lot of resources at you, and you probably can't see the bottom of the screen where I have the link, so you can grab the slides later and then find those resources later. So I'll share those slides after the presentation. So when talking about design, it was kind of difficult to create this presentation, as design is a gigantic area, and it's a lot like saying, here are the 9 biggest mistakes you're making in programming without really specifying the area of programming or narrowing it down. Just like programming, design is a huge, huge area, and in this presentation, I'm talking in big generalities, but hopefully some of them will help you out. I'm mostly talking about visual design and no code, really, but the kind of stuff where when you're working on websites or startup landing pages or mobile app design, some of the resources here to hopefully help you out to create better designs moving forward. So, without further ado, let's start out with number one. Number one mistake. You start out your design process, and you start out from scratch without inspiration or looking at other examples. Now, this is before the design process even starts, and I like to talk to developers or programmers who are jumping to design, letting them know that if you have a new design project and you take your desk and you wipe it clean and pull out a piece of paper and a pencil and you start sketching out your ideas, starting from scratch with a blank piece of paper is a lot like trying to program without the use of Stack Overflow or Google. You can do it. It is significantly harder. Places like Stack Overflow or being able to ask questions in Google and find the answers you need when you're programming, this is what inspiration is going to help you do with design. When you find things that you can use and be inspired by, not copy, but going out there and finding things that you can use in your own designs is going to make your design process faster and easier. Don't be afraid of imitation. Don't be afraid of going out there and finding what works and using that in your own design. Again, I'm going to emphasize, do not copy. Don't find a design you think is doing well and just copy it verbatim, because you'll get in very big trouble if people find out. Do not do that. You can be inspired by good design. For example, this is my book, Hello Web App, and I self-published it and designed it myself. And the cover of Hello Web App, you can see, is very strongly inspired by the covers of the books, A Book Apart books. I used them to inspire me to use bright colors and prominent typography, but I did not copy their design. But my book cover would not be like, wouldn't look like this if I wasn't so heavily inspired by A Book Apart. This is kind of a meme, a kind of a joke in the design community. There's this quote by Pablo Picasso, may or may not be actually by Pablo Picasso, that says, good artists copy, great artists steal. And of course, Bansky made that his own. Bad artists imitate, the great artists steal. There's even books on this whole process, Steal Like an Artist. There's many, many more like this. So if you're a developer, a new designer, someone who's jumping into this, do not be afraid of going out there and using what works. Don't start from scratch, but go out there and be inspired, and it's going to help you out in your design process. When it comes to finding design, how do you know? I'm focusing only on web design here, but how do you find inspiration? So there's a lot of websites that exist simply to share good design, or what people say is good design or trendy design right now. And you can go through here and find things that you like and things that you can be inspired by, like Sites Inspire. Dribbble is a great place for getting inspired for like little pieces of design, like buttons or navigations. Unmatched Style is another one for web design. There's awards. And don't forget to look at your competitors and see what they're doing well and what they're doing poorly, and see what you can learn from that. So not only be inspired by examples of good design that are online right now, but to also look at what you're competing against and seeing what else you might be missing or what you can do better than your competitors. And when you are looking at these examples of design, try to think critically about what makes them good or bad. For example, say if you popped onto the GitHub homepage and you say, hey, this is a pretty good-looking design. Instead of just saying, oh yeah, that's good, try to think about what is making it good. What are the design decisions that they're making in this website that makes it a strong design and work really well? For example, you could say, okay, there's a large amount of white space around the edges, which draws the attention into the content in the middle. The headline is really large and eye-catching. The form is right there. They don't require you to go to a second page. You can sign up right on the home page, another good design decision. They have open source and business highlighted in the content. So you see that, and you kind of immediately see upon skimming that it's a good design decision. The button is bright green, easy to see. Again, everything else is kind of gray. So there's a lot more design decisions you can pick out, but when you do this process, when you see a piece of design and you try to pick out what exactly it's doing correctly, it's going to help train your design intuition, train your design eye, and it's going to make it easier for you to make these decisions on your own in your future designs. Next up, the next design mistake. Your design is cluttered with too many fonts, colors, and inconsistencies and misalignments in the underlying grid. Clutter is the big visual design mistake that a lot of new designers make. For example, I love to show this because even though GoDaddy has since redesigned their website, this is the best example of a cluttered website I could find. Very classic. Lots of colors. Lots of different fonts. The grid is all over the place. Things are misaligned all over. Some pieces of content start here and some start right over there. All of these things kind of formed a very, very cluttered looking old website. And thankfully we've come pretty far since then in design. So when it comes to clutter, some of the ways to help solve clutter, number one is to just line things up. Because pixel differences between, say, vertical alignments, when something is a little bit misaligned with something else, is going to lead to an unconscious feeling of clutter. You want to have an underlying grid, this underlying skeleton that kind of lines everything up, which helps add to this feeling of cohesiveness. For example, I took this screenshot from Medium and kind of moved things around. And when things go back, you can see how normally, because everything is lined up under this grid, it's fairly cohesive. When you move things around, there's the feeling of chaos, this disorder is added just because things are not lining up together. Consistent spacing, not only lining stuff up under an underlying grid, but if you have a block and a space and a block and a space, you want to make sure that those spaces are consistent, and that's also going to be part of that underlying grid. For example, this is a design book called Design Plus Code, and they talk about having a 50 pixels padding between all the sections of the design, and this is going to add to that feeling of orderliness. Of course, this is made a lot simpler by using an integrated grid system that is in most of CSS frameworks that exist today, like Bootstrap, Foundation, and Skeleton. And there's quite a few others. But using these systems, instead of, say, starting out with your front-end development, using your CSS completely from scratch, this is where these systems excel, because you don't have to worry about building your grid. They are already included, and it's going to help you keep everything consistent, which is why I recommend using the systems, even though it does add some bloat into your front-end code. And of course, CSS Grid is kind of the new thing on the block that's coming more and more popular, which is going to help us create grids in our CSS without using a framework. So that's really awesome. Next up, when it comes to clutter, is color. Some principles I think about in color is just to reduce the amount of colors you use in your design. Of course, this is like a very overarching, extreme recommendation. Of course, you can use as many colors as you want, but it's a good rule of thumb as when you're starting out to reduce and just have a consistent color palette that you're choosing from if you're starting out with design. Try to keep your colors complementary, and I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that in a second. But another good rule of thumb is to use mostly neutrals and reserve a brighter color to make things stand out, like your CTAs, your buttons, things you want to draw attention to. Because if you have bright colors everywhere, nothing will stand out as compared if you have neutral colors, like the GitHub homepage with that bright button. This is where another one of my favorite shortcuts, where you can use another one of my favorite shortcuts, which is using a color palette website to generate your color palettes. I've been doing design. I have a degree in design. I've been designing websites since I was 12, and I never start from scratch when it comes to creating a color palette, even though I had the training in that, because it is such a pain in the butt. It is much easier to go to these color palette websites, even as a skilled designer, and work from there than creating from scratch, which is why I definitely recommend it to anyone who's just starting out in design. So, for example, there's many, many websites like this, but just a couple examples. Adobe Color CC, you can choose a color, you can click on complementary, and it just creates a color palette where these colors work together. Colormind.io is another recommendation. This one's fairly new. Again, another place where you can choose a color and start messing around, and it's going to help you generate color palettes with colors that work well together and saves you a lot of time. And then third, when it comes to typefaces and fonts, just like colors, you want to reduce the number of typefaces that you use in your design. You can use more. Like a good recommendation is to limit your number of fonts to 2. You can use more, but it's far better to say just use 2 different typefaces in your design and then vary the styles by bolding or italics or all caps, rather than using a completely different font. By limiting the number of fonts you use to just 2, you're going to create a more cohesive, less cluttered design. I also recommend to avoid using fancy or display fonts. Those ones, if you remember back in the early 2000s when you go to the font websites and you have all these crazy fonts that a lot of people love using in their images. Try to avoid using those and just stick with the basics when you're starting out, because the basic fonts are going to look less cluttered and it's going to get you farther than if you say go with something that looks wild or really swashy. For example, I went into my homepage and just changed all of the fonts just for fun. This is a very extreme example. I'm not saying that anyone's going to do this. But when you go from all of the fonts to just 2, mostly just this serif font that I'm using italics, and I'm adding colors, and I'm creating block quotes, but it's just one single font for the entire design. Of course, it makes it look more cohesive and less cluttered than if you have different fonts everywhere. Another example is my resume. Again, another place where I'm using typography, I'm using italics, and I'm using all caps to create the differences in the pieces of content, but there is only 2 different typefaces here, which is why it's one of the reasons why it looks more cohesive and less chaotic. The next mistake, your design lacks white space. And this is something I see in a lot of new designs. White space is a very hard thing for someone as a new designer to add to their design. So back to my homepage. This is okay, but without white space, it kind of just goes into one single block. When you're working on your design, try giving your design more white space than you initially think it needs. Try at least 50% more than you're originally comfortable with as a new designer. Now, this is kind of an extreme example, but this is, again, my before. And this is actually my homepage. And the reason why I did this, I have a large amount of white space at the top, is because I'm using the white space to draw attention to my name and my headline, and then decreasing the visual hierarchy of this other stuff. So the first thing you see is up top, and then you go to the bottom. Whereas here, without that white space, everything kind of mushes together. So you can use white space to draw attention to items. You can use white space to really give a large amount of emphasis to a part of your design. We don't have to just use giant amount of white space. You can use just a little to improve the way a design looks. So the New York Times website is it's a newspaper website, and it has to have a lot of information, and it can look very cluttered. And they did a famous redesign a few years ago. And along with reducing the amount of colors, they also added just a little bit more white space, just a little bit, mainly between the columns here, between the content. And just having that little bit of white space between the columns opens it up just enough that the after looks a little bit more cohesive and a little bit less chaotic. White space in designs makes a design feel more professional, and it'll make a design feel more luxurious. Luxurious, if you go to any kind of luxury website, like yachting, holidays, of course, they're going to use gigantic amount of white space. And this one does this pretty well because there's only a little bit of content in the center, but because they use this background image, it doesn't feel like you're using empty space. And if you go to these top design websites, these places that list good-looking designs, you notice that all of them use a large amount of white space. It's kind of an indicator nowadays of a modern design. But it's not just a visual thing, it's that white space can actually affect how well your website is used and how well people can use what you've done. It can affect your bottom line. In this example, between the form, one of the only things that they did in this experiment is on the left is the before, and they took out the blue links underneath the orange buttons, and they added a little bit more vertical white space. And in doing so, they saw a 20% improvement in engagement, 5% boost in products added to cart, and a 33% improvement in customers continuing through to purchase, just by adding a little bit of white space. Because the white space helps things stand out from each other because it adds more space. It draws the eye to the important things and makes things easier to use. So it not only is a visual thing that makes something look more modern, but it can affect how many people purchase something on what you've designed. In general, for these two sections, I kind of talk about clutter as one of the best. Reducing clutter is one of the best ways that you can improve your visual design. And you can do that by reducing the number of fonts and colors that you use, adding white space, and lining things up. If you're working on a design, aiming for a very clean and minimal design at the start is going to bring you a lot farther in visual design and help make your job as a designer easier. Next up, your content lacks contrast. This delightfully shows up on here just how I want it to show up. This is the UI Patterns website. It kind of drives me insane because it is a website that is based on good UI decisions, and yet they use this very light gray font that is very thin. And I am not that old, and I struggle to read this website, and it drives me nuts that they're trying to talk about good design decisions when their content is nigh unreadable. So there's a lot of websites that do this. They have, they forget about contrast when it comes to content. But there's also the problem of forgetting about when you have an image behind content, making the content on top of the image unreadable. Like a few days ago, where you can barely read, Trump's lawyer says he's wrote blah, 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 because you can't read that. The big trend right now is to use giant images at the top of your blog posts, and then forgetting that the text on top of that image needs to be readable. Like you probably barely could have seen the fact that it has additional content in there, and this background even makes you can read it because the text is pretty large and white, but it still adds some confusion by having that so close, those colors so close together. Make sure you have enough contrast between your content and the background, because your content is the thing you want people to actually read. So there's some resources that you can use to help check whether you have enough contrast. So for the UI Patterns website, if they put in their text color and their background color, it would hopefully be able to tell them that they do not use and aren't using enough contrast in their text color to provide an adequate contrast for someone to read. Now, this is not, again, I'm pretty young. It was hard enough for me to read it. But remember, there's people out there with disabilities, people who are colorblind, people who are older trying to read your website. So even if you can read it, does not necessarily mean that everyone can read it. So this kind of resource is a good, WebAIM is a good place to check, double check. A quick tidbit, this is not really a mistake, but just something I find amusing though, is that there is a Goldilocks amount of contrast, because if you have too much contrast, it's going to be hard to see on the screen, but if you have black text on white background, of course it has plenty of contrast to read, but the amount of contrast is so high it can strain eyes. And if you just add it to a very dark gray rather than using black, it can reduce the strain eyes and make your content look a little bit nicer and easier to read. Obviously, not as important as making sure that you have dark enough text, but just FYI, using black text on white isn't a perfect solution. You probably want to use something like a dark gray. Not just colors and backgrounds, but you also want to make sure that your content is easy to read and understand. This is a very 90s era website mistake where you don't use any styling, you don't have any CSS to add columns. And there is a problem here where in typography, you want to make sure that the lines, the amount of words per line of text is not too long. Because when you have something going that amount of width, it makes it very, very hard to read. If you take the width of your column, of your text column, and you shorten it, it's going to make it easier for your user to read your content at a glance. It makes it easier for the brain to kind of skim that content and read faster than if it is too wide. The perfect amount of space is generally between 45 and 75 characters per sentence. And when it comes to web design, there are things like bookmarklets that will help you determine whether your content is too long and alert you that you need to make some changes to your CSS or your underlying grid in order to make sure that something doesn't become too long. Now, because we have responsive designs and gigantic monitors, this is something to pay attention to as you create your designs. And make sure that if you take your design that looks great on a 13-inch MacBook Pro and move it over into a 29-inch MacBook or iMac, make sure that your column doesn't get too wide to make it too hard to read. But it's not just the length of the content, the width of the content, but it's also the length. And you want to make sure that you're not creating paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of content, because on the web, again, people skim. No one really reads in depth unless they get really interested in the content you have. And so when you're writing your content, you're writing your about page or a blog post or whatnot, remember that less is more. Try to simplify your sentences. Try to shorten what you've written. Remember that big paragraphs are also a sign of clutter. When someone lands on a homepage and they see that they have an essay to read, they're more likely to hit back and move on to something else than read what you've written. And then if you can't simplify your content, also look into breaking into bullets. When I'm talking about simplification, this is a sentence. This is a perfectly accurate, perfectly accurate sentence. When you say, please note that although Chrome is supported for both Mac and Windows operating systems, it is recommended that all users of the site switch to the most up-to-date version of the Firefox web browser for the best possible results. There's no grammar issues here. There's no spelling issues. It is English, but it is a mouthful. And you can rewrite that. Too simply, for best results, use the latest version of Firefox. Chrome for Mac and Windows is also supported. This is what I mean about simplification, removing those extra words, making something easier to read. So pay attention to this when you're working on your content and see where you can reduce the length of what you've written. You can also, like I said, break into bullets. I don't know why that's centered, but if this paragraph on the left is also unreadable, is too long, too much information. And for the skimmers on the web, just breaking into bullets is going to make something a little easier to read. The bullets gives a place, skimming it to jump between the pieces of information. This is also kind of unreadable, which is why I like to use strategic bolding. You might see this in a lot of blog posts on Medium. A lot of people are using this now for content to pull out the most important information in a piece of content. So for the people who are skimming the content, they can just read, registration chapter has been split in two. And if they're like, oh, that's interesting, then they can read further. But by pulling out that important information and adding bolding, it's going to make your content easier to skim, and ergo, more people are probably going to read your content. And then always add some white space if you can. If you have the ability to add spacing in between your bullets to really pop out your information, it's going to make your design easier to read. Next up in content is not just your actual content, but look at your headlines and make sure that your headlines are also short and simple and easy to read, but also are exciting. This is technically what my book is about. My books are an introduction to building web apps using Python and Django, but this as a headline this would be terrible. This is a terrible, terrible headline. It is too long, it is too wordy, and it is super boring. When it comes to headlines, you want to make sure that you're talking benefits, not details. The headline for the page, what is it doing for the reader, not what it is. You want to make sure to keep it short and simple, just like we talked about in the last section. And I recommend you use natural and friendly language. Sound like a human, not like a corporate robot. So going back to this example, update that to something a lot shorter, a lot more exciting. Learn to build a web app. Because this is, instead of saying, what's my book's about, which is Python and Django, it is saying, what is it doing for the person coming to this web page? It's going to teach them how to build a web app. Shorter, simpler, and talking benefits, not details. The same thing for widgets. Same example. Download my book on learning how to program Django. We can update this widget and all of the content to be shorter, simpler, more human. We can change that out to learn how to make web apps. And shorten the content in the center. We can add that strategic bolding. We can change that button at the bottom from a very boring download to something that says semi-free info, which is more exciting. So these are the kind of content changes you can do when working on your design to make sure that what you're designing is exciting and more clickable and more interesting to the user. And these things also affect your bottom line. This example, this case study, how a simple headline change improved conversions by 52.8%. All they did was change their headline on their web page from something that talked about what their product was to what their product did for the user. And that simple one-sentence change improved their conversions, the amount of people who clicked through and bought their product, by 52.8%. So it's not just a nice thing to do for the users, but it can actually lead to more money in your pocket. Next up, it is hard for your users to find what you want them to do. And I want to talk a little bit about user experience here. This is Gumroad, the website Gumroad that I used to use for selling my books. And I've been using it, long story short, I released a new book this year. For the Kickstarter, I have a benefit where if someone ordered a certain tier of the Kickstarter, they would get my old books. And when I gave them that reward, I sent them a link to Gumroad, and I said, okay, you click this link, you'll get the books. And this is what the link pops up to the user. And I get emails every single day, including today, from someone saying, I went to that webpage and I could not figure out how to download the books. And it's because that I want this button is a ghost button. It doesn't look like a button, and no one knows to click on it. And it drives me absolutely batty that this website chose to use this very stylish, very modern, ghost, non-looking button for their product, which is leading to a lot of problems on my end, where I have to constantly email back to them saying, hey, you see this, I want this area, click that, even though it doesn't look clickable. And it's not like Gumroad doesn't have good buttons. I I included my admin bar, where you can see they have this button at the top right that says Save Changes that looks like a button. It's green, it has a gradient, it looks clickable, and yet on their user-facing view, they have these buttons that are not usable. Drives me absolutely batty, which is why I'm switching off of Gumroad. When it comes to your actions on your design, when you want someone to do something, you want them to sign up for a newsletter on your blog, or if you want them to click the button at the end of the form, you want to make sure that people can see what you want them to do. Don't use a ghost button that doesn't really translate as a button to the user. Try to use something that looks like that's bright and easy to use and looks like a button or looks like a link or it stands out. For example, again, the newsletter, if you have a blog, you want people to sign up, give you their email. You don't want to hide the link in the content, and it's the left side that blends in. There's nothing that indicates a link. There's no underline. It has a different color. But if you take that and you make it its own section, you add a headline, you put the form in there, you use a button that looks like a button, you're going to improve the amount of people who give you their email address. Don't hide these actions. And when you're creating design, don't just look at the visual design, but look at what you want people to do and make sure that it is easy and convenient for them to do it. This is why buttons on widgets are a bright, standout color. You don't want them to fade into the background. You want someone to look at it and understand what they need to do. And I use a ghost button, just admit, on my web page, but it's because it's right next to an actual bright-looking, more important button called Get the Books. And so you can use these trendy ghost button outline buttons next to an actual button to kind of show hierarchy between the two buttons, but don't use them on their own. This is also a place where those color principles, when I said you can use mostly neutral colors and use a bright bright color to make something stand out. This website is very gray and desaturated, and they have a bright blue button in the center to draw the eye and hopefully lead to more people doing what they want them to do. And it's not just buttons. It can be widgets in a sidebar. The Wealthfront engineering blog, you can argue the reason why they have this blog, the reason they talk about their engineering principles and problems is because they want other engineers to read what they've written and go, it would be great to work at Wealthfront, which is why on the sidebar they have this bright green-blue widget to draw the eye and get people to read, interested in what you see here, join our team and submit an application. They don't hide it. They make sure it's visible. It's not like obnoxious in the content, but it's there, it's visible, it's easy to see. Next principle, your design takes too long to download. And this is becoming more and more of a problem over the last few years. The average web page is now the size of the original Doom, which is kind of impressive. There's a few things to do when you're looking at your website and making sure that it is fast to download, because it's really easy to add those giant images, beautiful retina, multiple images for different resolutions, and all the new JavaScript frameworks and all the CSS frameworks and everything. You can bloat your web page and make it hard to download. Like I am from North America, and I'm on a cell phone connection here, which really reminds me about how bloated web pages can be when I'm browsing them on my phone or if I'm using tethering. So, remind yourself every now and then, go onto a slower connection and look at what you've designed and see if it's a good experience. So one of my favorite resources for images, because images are one of the biggest things that can bloat the web page size. Image Optim is a utility. I believe it's for Windows as well, but here's the Mac app, where you can just simply drag your images into the utility, and it decreases the size of the images without noticeably reducing quality. It's super simple. I highly recommend it. Another place where web pages can get bloated is when you're using web fonts or these beautiful fonts through You want to use something that's not a system font like Verdana or all the other system fonts. So if you have a beautiful font you want to use in your website, make sure that you're serving it correctly, because you can really slow down your website when you're using custom fonts. And then JavaScript is the other place where web pages can become too bloated. So look at your JavaScript and optimize your JavaScript, minimize it, see what you can do to reduce the size of the download to make sure that people can load your website quickly and they don't just leave out of frustration. All of these things you can find if you go into Google's page speed insights. If you put your website or what you've designed in here, your website URL in here, it will create a pretty awesome report with recommendations of what to do. So it goes into CSS optimization, shows you the image sizes, shows you everything. It's a really great tool. I wouldn't worry too much about getting to 100%. They have like a little score, and I don't think I've ever seen anything get to 100%, but it's, so it can be kind of intimidating, but it's a very good tool for getting some of the big things out of the way. Last but not least, make sure that your design works on all different sizes. And this one's hard for me because I've been building websites again since I was 12, and so I remember the days where you just built one website in one size and it just worked. And now you have to do iPhone and iPad and Android phones and all the different sizes of iPhones, and it gets kind of overwhelming. And when you're trying to design something, you want to get it out as fast as possible, and instead you have to spend time testing on every single device. It drives me nuts, but you have to do it. So for example, responsive design. This is because people using the internet via their phone is now surpassing the desktop. And so you want to especially look at phone sizes and make sure, again, your design downloads fast because they're probably on a slow LTE 3G connection, but also make sure that your design looks good in a smaller format and is easy to use. People can still find and use and do what you want them to do on your website. This is another place where I like to use a framework here because I don't have to worry about building my CSS to work with responsive design. I can just use, say, the utilities in Bootstrap instead. This is why I use Bootstrap, even though it can be a very bloated front-end, bloated piece of code, but these responsive utilities and other things it gives me, like the grid and all that, makes it so I don't have to worry about creating a brand new responsive website from scratch. It saves me a lot of time, which is why I recommend using something that has responsive utilities like this, like Bootstrap. I'm going to conclude with a little bit of a reassurance, because if you're a person who's jumping into design who's not a designer, it can be very scary when you're working on design and feeling very overwhelmed. This is my thought process every single time. Again, I have a degree in design. I've been doing design for many, many, many years. And every single time I start working on a new design, this is what goes on through my head. It's terrible. It's just like, crap, crap, crap. This is horrible. I'm a terrible designer. And nothing is working right. Why am I doing this? And there's a certain moment where I'm working on design where something starts working better. But without fail, whenever I start my design process, it always sucks. So if you are working on your design and you're working on design and you're thinking, oh, I'm a terrible designer, I shouldn't be doing this, I should just go back to what I was doing before, it doesn't mean that you're a bad designer. It just means you are a designer. Welcome to the world of design. So these resources are in my book, Hello Web Design. This is my third book I just released. I unfortunately don't have any physical copies with me, but if you email me, come back to me afterwards, I will give you a discount code and work something out with you. Otherwise, thank you so much for having me here.